The Galactic Scholarly Consortium had a rule: observe, document, never interfere. Simple enough, right? Except nobody told them that studying humans would be the academic equivalent of sticking your hand into a beehive and being surprised when things got complicated. My name is Vrethok San, Senior Research Fellow of the Consortium's Xenocognitive Division, and I am going to tell you exactly how a routine academic study of a primitive species turned into the single most disorienting experience in the history of interstellar science. I say this as someone who once spent 14 months cataloging the mating calls of methane-breathing jellyfish from the Orion Spur. That was relaxing by comparison. It started, as most catastrophic ideas do, with funding. The consortium had approved a modest research grant to study what our preliminary surveys classified as a Class 4 emergent civilization: carbon-based, bipedal, technologically adolescent, emotionally volatile. The report from our survey drones described humans as, quote, a species displaying rudimentary tool use, tribal social organization, and an alarming tendency to resolve resource disputes with their fists. The grant committee found this charming. They approved the budget without hesitation and assigned a team of 5 researchers to what they expected would be a straightforward 2-year observation study. They sent us to a place the humans call Earth, which, by the way, they named after dirt, the actual ground beneath their feet. I want you to sit with that for a moment. They looked at an entire planet, a world of oceans, mountains, forests, storms, tectonic magnificence, and named it after the stuff they tracked inside on their boots. My colleague Palis Drew, our team's linguist, spent 3 days just processing that information. She kept muttering to herself in the observation bay. We were a little worried about her. Our team assembled on the research vessel Quiet Margin, parked in a geosynchronous orbit behind Earth's largest natural satellite. Palis handled language acquisition. Then there was Torvan Hex, our neuroscientist, a meticulous, deeply humorless individual who communicated primarily in footnotes and sighs. Our behavioral analyst was a young researcher named Quilly, fresh out of the consortium's graduate program, so enthusiastic about fieldwork that it genuinely made the rest of us uncomfortable. Rounding out the team was our senior observer, a veteran scholar named Demethus Oves, who had studied 43 civilizations across 6 galactic sectors and had the permanent expression of someone who had seen too much and slept too little. Demethus briefed us on our first morning in orbit with his characteristic efficiency. We observe, he said. We record. We do not project our own cognitive frameworks onto the subject species. We do not assume. We document. He looked specifically at Quilly when he said the last part. Quilly nodded vigorously and took 12 pages of notes about the briefing itself. For the first 3 weeks, everything proceeded normally. We monitored communications, observed behavioral patterns, cataloged social structures. Humans, from a distance, followed fairly predictable emergent civilization models. They had hierarchies. They traded resources, they built things, broke things, argued about things, occasionally apologized about things. Standard material. Then Torvan Hex ran his first comparative cognitive analysis, and that is when our 2-year study turned into something else entirely. He came to the common area on a Tuesday, which is what the humans call the 3rd day of their arbitrary weekly cycle, and he stood in the doorway holding his data tablet with both hands, saying nothing. Torvan Hex never said nothing. Torvan Hex filled silence with subclauses and technical qualifiers the way other people filled silence with breathing. Torvan, Demethus said. Report. I need, Torvan said slowly, to rerun this analysis, because either my equipment is malfunctioning, or I have made an error somewhere, or he stopped, or this species thinks in a way that should not be physically possible given their neurological architecture. We gathered around his display. The data was dense, the kind of cognitive mapping output that usually looked like orderly branching structures. Cause, effect, inference, conclusion, linear chains of thought, building toward decisions the way bricks build toward a wall. Clean. Predictable, the sort of thing you could model. What Torvan's analysis showed was not that. It looked, if you will forgive me reaching for an analogy, like someone had taken that orderly wall of bricks, thrown them all into the air simultaneously, and then somehow caught them in a configuration that was not a wall, but also, inexplicably, held up a ceiling. "What am I looking at?" Quilly asked. "Parallel associative processing," Torvan said, and his voice had gone very quiet. The voice of a scientist who has found something that rearranges their assumptions. They are not thinking in sequences. They are thinking in nets, webs, multiple unrelated concepts firing simultaneously, and finding connections that are not logical but are functionally correct. They reach accurate conclusions through routes that should not produce accurate conclusions. Dimithas studied the display for a long moment. "Give me a practical example." Torvain pulled up a case study. He had been monitoring a human we had designated Subject 11, a middle-aged individual named Pharaohs, who worked in a profession the humans called architecture, which involved designing structures for other humans to inhabit. Torvain had been recording Pharaohs' cognitive activity during a professional problem-solving session. Pharaohs had been given a structural challenge, how to redesign a building's load-bearing configuration to accommodate a larger open floor plan without compromising integrity. The expected cognitive path: assess load requirements, identify structural constraints, calculate viable redistribution options, select optimal configuration. 43 minutes of focused analytical work by consortium estimates. Pharaohs had solved it in 11 minutes. His solution was not just correct, it was, according to our own engineering models, elegant in ways that shaved unnecessary material costs and improved long-term stress distribution beyond what the problem had even asked for. "Now watch how he got there," Torvan said. The recording showed Pharaohs working, but also, simultaneously, humming something, a musical pattern. And at the point where his cognitive scan spiked, where the solution crystallized, he had not been thinking about the building at all. He had been thinking about a song, specifically about the structural pattern of a bridge in a piece of music he had apparently heard as a child. He mapped the musical structure onto the engineering problem, metaphorically, intuitively, in a leap that had no formal logical justification, and arrived at a result that formal logic, had it taken the long way around, would have eventually confirmed. None of us spoke for a moment. "That is not how cognition works," Palis said finally. "I know," said Torvan. "You cannot solve a load-bearing calculation by thinking about music. I know. The two domains have no formal relationship. I know, Palis, I know. And yet," he gestured at the screen. "He did. We reran the analysis 12 times. We cross-checked it against 6 other subjects: Nadia, a medical researcher, a teenage human named Emilio who spent most of his time playing competitive video games, an elderly woman named Beatrice who taught what the humans called philosophy, a construction worker named Rashid, and a musician named Su Yun who, it turned out, was also a self-taught structural engineer on the side. Which, honestly, even now, I find offensive. Pick a lane, Su-Yun. The rest of us have enough trouble being competent in one field." Every single one of them showed the same pattern. Different inputs, different domains, different life contexts, same underlying cognitive architecture. They all thought sideways. They reached conclusions by routes that defied sequential logic and arrived, consistently, at outputs that sequential logic would have taken far longer to produce, if it produced them at all. Torvan, to his credit, did not panic. He cataloged, he documented, he built a theoretical framework around what he was seeing, which he tentatively titled Non-Linear Associative Intelligence in Emergent Bipedal Species, and which the rest of us privately called the "How are they doing that" problem. Then Quilly, who had been very quiet and very busy in the corner for several days, raised his hand. "I found something else," he said. He had been cross-referencing the cognitive data with historical records, specifically with the developmental timeline of human civilization. Standard practice: you map cognitive architecture against cultural output to see if the thinking style explains the history. What Quilly had found was that it did explain the history, but not in the way any of us had expected. "Look at the acceleration points," he said, projecting the timeline. "Everywhere human civilization takes a sudden leap, a non-linear jump in technology, art, social organization, scientific understanding. It corresponds not to gradual accumulation of knowledge, but to moments where one human combined two unrelated fields, two unrelated ideas, things that had no business being in the same room together, that somehow produced a third thing neither of them was. He highlighted the examples. A human who applied principles from a weaving loom to the construction of computing devices. Another who looked at the behavior of birds and redesigned the geometry of flight. A scientist who solved a fundamental problem in genetics by thinking about it through the lens of cryptography. They have been doing this for their entire recorded history, Quilly said. They do not know they are doing it. It is not a technique they developed, it is simply how they are. Demethus Ove, who had studied 43 civilizations and spent his career watching species slowly and predictably accumulate capability the way rivers slowly and predictably accumulate sediment. Demethus Ove sat back in his chair and said, very quietly, "Oh, that particular O had a lot of freight in it. I know, because I have played it back several times in the years since. It had in it the sound of a very experienced scientist, revising something fundamental. They are not accumulating intelligence," Demethus said. They are generating it, combinatorially. Every time two unrelated concepts exist in the same mind, they produce a new concept that neither concept was. At scale, Torvan added. 8 billion individuals, each one a combinatorial engine, each one feeding outputs back into the shared cultural pool, which feeds inputs back into the next generation of individuals. It compounds, Palis said. She had gone slightly pale. It is not linear. It is not even exponential in the conventional sense. It is recursive, said Quilly. The outputs become inputs become new outputs, continuously, without a theoretical ceiling. We all looked at the timeline again, at the acceleration curves, at where humans had been 400 years ago, scattered, pre-industrial, warring city-states, and where they were now. And then Demethus said the thing none of us had wanted to say out loud. How long, he said, until they notice what they are doing? Nobody answered Demethus immediately. That is the thing about truly uncomfortable questions. They do not generate quick responses. They generate the particular silence of 5 researchers staring at a data screen, each privately doing the same calculation, and each privately arriving at the same answer, and each privately hoping someone else would say it first. Quilly said it first, because Quilly was 26 years old and had not yet learned the diplomatic value of hesitation. 50 years, he said, maybe less. If their current cross-disciplinary research trends continue at the present rate, they will begin formally studying their own cognitive architecture within a generation, and once they understand how they think, they will optimize it, Torvain finished. His voice was flat, neutral, the voice of a scientist delivering a finding that has moved beyond the comfortable category of interesting and into the deeply unsettling category of consequential. Demethus stood up from the table. He walked to the observation port and looked down at the planet for a long moment. Blue and white and deceptively calm from up here, the way all things look deceptively calm from far enough away. Then he turned around and said, "I want full cognitive mapping on 200 subjects, diverse geographic distribution, age range, professional background. I want Palis cross-referencing every major human technological leap of the last 3 centuries against the associative transfer model. I want this documented completely before we file a single word with the consortium." "Why before we file?" I asked. Demethus looked at me. "Because once we file," he said, "this stops being our study." That was the moment I understood the weight of what we had found. The consortium had protocols for everything. For first contact, for pre-contact observation, for technological parity assessments, for civilizations that developed faster than projected. What it did not have, anywhere in its 4,000-year archive of xenocognitive research, was a documented case of a species whose fundamental thinking architecture had no theoretical ceiling. We were not just writing a research paper. We were writing a warning. The question was, a warning for whom? We spent the next 4 months doing exactly what Demethus ordered. 200 subjects, complete cognitive mapping. I will not bore you with every detail of the process, but I will tell you the highlights because some of them were, and I say this as someone who does not use the word lightly, astonishing. Subject 44 was a 12-year-old human named Priya who lived in a city of approximately 20 million people and spent her afternoons building small mechanical devices from discarded components. Nothing unusual about that, in terms of emergent civilization juveniles displaying engineering intuition. What was unusual was what Torvin found when he mapped her cognitive activity during construction. She was not following any known problem-solving model. She was running something closer to aesthetic evaluation. She was asking not, will this work, but does this feel right? And the two questions were, in her mind, the same question. Her error rate was lower than our own engineering AI assistants. She was 12. She thought beautiful and functional were synonyms. She had arrived at that conclusion entirely on her own. Subject 91 was a retired military officer named Gavriel, who now spent his time painting landscapes and had developed, in the process, a proprietary color-mixing theory that, when Pallas ran the formal analysis, turned out to be a valid and previously undocumented model for light behavior in particulate atmospheres. He was not a physicist. He had never studied physics. He had just been trying to accurately paint fog. Subject 163 was a woman named Imara, who worked in what humans called conflict mediation, resolving disputes between parties who had decided they hated each other. Her cognitive scans during active mediation sessions were the most complex we recorded. She was simultaneously modeling the emotional state of each party, the historical grievances driving current behavior, the linguistic subtext beneath the spoken words, the likely outcome of approximately 40 different conversational paths, and, underneath all of it, running what appeared to be a musical rhythm, a steady pulse that she used apparently without knowing she used it, to regulate her own stress response while performing all of the above. Torvin watched the scan for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "She is running a 7-thread parallel process. I have colleagues at the Consortium Institute who cannot run 4, and she was a mediator in a mid-sized city in a continent called Africa. Not a famous human, not a celebrated one, just a person doing her job. That was the part that kept catching us off guard. Not the exceptional humans, not the geniuses and the celebrated minds, but the ordinary ones. The ones who were not considered remarkable by their own civilization standards, the ones who were, by human metrics, simply average, because by any other civilization's cognitive metrics, they were not average at all. They were extraordinary, and they were 8 billion strong." Pallas finished her historical cross-reference in the 3rd month and presented her findings to us with the expression of someone who has followed a pleasant-looking path into a forest and gradually realized they are not sure they remember how to get out. "Every major human civilizational acceleration," she said, "is preceded by a period of what I can only describe as forced cross-pollination. Historical circumstances that pushed humans from different knowledge traditions into contact with each other. Trade routes, migrations, wars, unfortunately, the printing press, the internet." She paused. "Each time their information-sharing capacity expanded, their combinatorial output did not increase proportionally. It increased geometrically. They are not just generating novel connections individually, they are generating novel connections between their novel connections. The network thinks, not just the nodes, collective associative intelligence," Torvin murmured. "And they have spent the last 30 years, Pallas continued, building the most sophisticated information-sharing network in the history of their species, connecting every human mind on the planet to every other human mind in real time." She let that sit for a moment. "They did not build it as a cognitive experiment. They built it to share pictures of their food and argue about sports. But what it has functionally created is a planetary-scale associative processing network, 8 billion nodes running continuously, and they have absolutely no idea. Demethus, who had been standing very still during this presentation, said one word: timeline. Pallas pulled up the projection. If current connectivity growth and cross-disciplinary research trends continue without interruption, and there is no current mechanism to interrupt them, we estimate that within 30 to 40 years, humans will achieve a level of collective cognitive output that exceeds the current combined research capacity of the 12 senior consortium civilizations. Nobody said anything for a very long time. I want to be clear about what that meant. The Galactic Scholarly Consortium's 12 senior civilizations represented a combined 60,000 years of accumulated scientific and cultural development, 60,000 years of careful, methodical, sequential accumulation, the slow and dignified way that intelligent species were supposed to develop. Humans were proposing, through sheer structural accident, to equal that output within the professional lifetime of the researchers currently sitting in this room, eating nutrient paste and trying to remember how to breathe normally. Quilly, who had been uncharacteristically quiet for several weeks, spoke up. "I want to propose a thought that is going to be uncomfortable," he said. "More uncomfortable than the last 3 months?" I asked. "Yes," he said, significantly. He straightened in his chair. "We have been framing this as a discovery about human cognition, a finding we will document and submit and let the consortium assess. But I think we have been asking the wrong question. We have been asking what humans are. We have not been asking what happens to everyone else when humans figure out what humans are." Demethus looked at him carefully. "Continue." "They are not a threat," Quilly said quickly. "I want to be precise about that. I am not suggesting threat assessment. But consider, every civilization in the consortium developed within its own cognitive framework. We built our sciences, our philosophies, our social architectures to match how we think, sequentially, hierarchically, premise, inference, conclusion, and then we contacted each other, and we shared knowledge, but we shared it within those frameworks, because all of our frameworks were compatible, linear to linear." He paused. "Humans think in a way that is not compatible with those frameworks. When they join the conversation, and they will join the conversation, there is no scenario in which they do not. They will not just contribute new information. They will generate connections between concepts that none of us have connected. They will look at 6,000 years of consortium science and see relationships in it that we have never seen. And some of those relationships will be correct." "You are saying," Pallas said slowly, "that they will understand our science better than we do." "I am saying," Quilly said, "that they will understand it differently, and that different might produce things that our version of understanding never could." Demethus walked back to the observation port. He stood there for a long time, looking at the planet. I watched him, and I thought about Pharaohs and his musical bridge solution, and Priya with her beautiful machines, and Gavriel accidentally inventing atmospheric physics while trying to paint fog, and Imara running 7 cognitive threads simultaneously while 2 people argued about property boundaries, and I thought about 8 billion of them down there, connected, compounding, not knowing what they were, not yet. "We filed the full report," Demethus said finally. "Everything. The cognitive mapping, the historical analysis, Pallas's projections, Quilly's framework, complete and unredacted." He turned around. "And we include a formal recommendation." "What recommendation?" I asked. "That the consortium make first contact," he said. "Not in 30 years, when humans come looking. Now, while they are still learning what they are. Because the version of this species that discovers its own nature in isolation, without anyone to meet them in that moment, without any established relationship or shared context, that version is a variable we cannot model. But the version that makes that discovery as part of a conversation they are already in." He paused, and something crossed his expression that I had never seen on Demethus Ove's face before. Something that on a younger researcher I might have called excitement. "That version is a partner." We filed the report 14 days later. I will not pretend the consortium received it calmly. There were approximately 4 months of institutional anxiety, 17 emergency committee sessions, and 1 formal motion to classify the findings and bury them in an archive on the grounds that the implications were, quote, destabilizing to established civilizational frameworks. That motion failed, largely because Demethus presented before the full scholarly assembly and said, with the authority of 43 studied civilizations behind him, that the consortium's purpose was the advancement of knowledge, not the protection of its own comfort, and that any body calling itself a scholarly consortium that responded to an extraordinary discovery by hiding it had missed the entire point of the endeavor. The motion failed by a wide margin. I like to think it would have failed anyway. I genuinely do. First contact was initiated in the year the humans called 2031. It did not go as anyone expected, but that, by that point, should have surprised no one. Humans never go as expected. It is, as it turns out, their defining feature, their central characteristic, the core of whatever marvelous and chaotic thing they are. My name is Vrethok San. I have spent 11 years now in formal academic collaboration with human researchers. Priya grew up and built things that bent the known rules of materials science. Imara consulted on 3 consortium diplomatic restructurings that our own specialists had failed to resolve. A human named Callum, who started as a theoretical physicist and ended up rewriting 3 chapters of consortium cosmology because he thought the existing model, quote, felt structurally wrong, like a song in the wrong key, and then proceeded to prove himself correct through 4 years of work. I will be honest with you. There are still mornings when I look at the data and feel the particular vertigo of standing at the edge of something I cannot fully see. The consortium's scientists are extraordinary. Human scientists are something that does not have an adequate word yet in any language I speak. The word will probably be invented by a human, drawing on 2 unrelated etymological roots, arriving at a meaning that is more precisely right than anything a sequential process could have generated. I am provisionally prepared to be fine with that. We studied humans because we thought we were studying something smaller than us. We realized, somewhere over a blue and dirt-named planet, that we had been wrong about the size of what we were looking at. I recommend, to anyone who finds themselves underestimating a species on the grounds that it has only recently discovered the wheel or the written word or the networked computer, look more carefully. Ask not just what they know, but how they know it. Ask not just what they have built, but what happens when they put 2 things together that have never been in the same room. And if you find yourself looking at their data and hearing something that sounds, in the back of your very logical sequential mind, uncomfortably like music, pay attention to that. They usually have something to teach you.